Welcome to St Martin the Fields, and welcome to the second lecture in our Autumn 2020 lecture series, In What Do We Trust? Today, Richard and I have the great privilege of sitting in the Master's Lodge at Magdalen College in Cambridge with the Most Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, and for just a few days more, Master of Magdalen College. Rowan is going to talk to us about trust, hope, and faith. I'm not going to give him more of an introduction. We know him and love him and are longing to hear what he's got to say.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and as always a great privilege to be invited to speak, not literally this time in St Martin's, but to and for St Martin's, and to renew contact with many people who are very precious to me there. As you've heard, I want to talk a bit about trust, hope, and faith, and particularly focusing on that middle word, hope, certainly something we need to be thinking about at the moment quite a lot. It's actually not that easy to define it. It's a word we use a great deal. We sign off on messages with, hope to see you soon. We might say, I hope the pandemic is over by Christmas. I might say, I hope this lecture makes sense to somebody. And what it seems we're really saying there is, I wish this was so. This is a state of affairs I'd be very happy with. I'd like to see it happen. And yet, it does seem that when we start thinking a bit harder about hope and its relationship to faith and trust, the word begins to open out in front of us. It's more than just a feeling, for example. A recent interview I saw on the subject described hope rather memorably as a grave but positive emotion. It's a nice phrase, except that the word emotion isn't quite it. There are people, we might say, are holding firmly to hope and to faith, even in the middle of feelings that are extremely mixed and perhaps rather negative. It's no accident that one of the great classics to come out of Stalinist Russia on this subject was Nadezhda Mandelштam's amazing memoir, Hope Against Hope, and its sequel, Hope Abandoned. She speaks there of what it was like living in an environment where positive feelings were not in great supply. There wasn't very much ground for looking forward to anything, and yet, in some bizarre way, something survived that was called hope. And it wasn't just positive feeling, and it certainly wasn't a confidence that it's all going to turn out all right, or I have a good feeling about this. And it wasn't just desire either. And perhaps that's where the real link comes in with faith. The hope that Nadezhda Mandelstam talks about, the hope that many people in really dire circumstances speak of, is a confidence, a settled confidence, somewhere underneath all the ups and downs of feeling. And that connects a little bit with the fact that in Christian tradition, faith, hope, and love are sometimes referred to as the theological virtues. As a branding exercise, that particular term isn't a great success. But if we stop and think what exactly is in the background there, we can perhaps see the connection. A virtue, in this connection, is a good habit, a pattern of reacting, responding to the world that is settled. To put it very simply, rather crudely, you get into the groove of responding in a certain way. And when trust and hope and love are settled responses, not just feelings that come and go, but real ingrained habits, you can talk about them as truly virtues. But then what on earth does it mean to talk of them as theological virtues? Theological virtue sounds like the kind of scholarship in the ancient world that gets you doctorates of divinity. But in fact, to say that something is a theological virtue means it's connected with something other than your own achievements and attainments, your own capacity to get on top of things. In the framework that many Christians have worked in over the centuries, faith and hope and love are not things you get by trying hard. They have about them a character of gift, of gratuity. Something is poured in from beyond you. It's not about your effort or your success. So, for example, you can, by good practice, make yourself a bit braver, a bit more generous, a bit more self-controlled, all the things that belong in the classical language about the virtues. But how do you make yourself more trusting, more hopeful, or more loving? Well, not just by practice, not just by effort, but by something more like a letting go and opening up to what is decisively and significantly outside your control and outside your resources. So let's follow that up just for a moment in connection with the treatment of these subjects by the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas. He talks about hope as an orientation to a future good, something desirable, something positive, that is, as he says, difficult but possible. Difficult but possible. Difficult because we can't see how we, as individuals, or even we as a group, could possibly get there. And yet we have a confidence that it's possible. And that's the element of gift, the element of something coming from beyond our own resources here. So that faith or trust, hope and love are not related primarily to ourselves, what we think about ourselves and our capacity. They're related to the way we think the world is, and ultimately, therefore, in this context, the way we think God is. Thomas Aquinas says that faith and hope and love all have God for their first object. They look towards, they depend on, they're animated by that infinite resource far beyond us. And Aquinas says quite explicitly that hope in humanity may be a perfectly good thing, but it's not enough. And if it's all you've got, then actually your resources are no greater and your confidence no deeper. Indeed, there's a risk there. If you put your hope in your own resources, you'll very soon be disappointed. But if you put your hope in the resources of humanity as a collective, you're likely to be disappointed. There needs to be a confidence in something that goes deeper than my success or failure, but even deeper than the success or failure of the human race itself. And that's putting it fairly strongly. And that's why the language about trust and hope is so challenging for us. We'd like to know where we can nail our colours in the human world. All right, if not to ourselves, then at least to some programme, or some hero, some party, some manifesto. And unfortunately, that's not quite going to do. When, not if, but when, failure happens, we may be very tempted to despair. Or we may put all our eggs in one basket, deny the difficulty, the limitation of the resources we're working with, and end up with what the tradition regards as the opposite sin to despair, and that is presumption, thinking we can sort it all out. What's the relation, then, between trust and hope here? I'll come to love in a moment. Well, in this particular discussion, which I've already mentioned, Thomas Aquinas says that our trust, our faith, has to do with divine truth. We're aware that there is something that is real. Never mind what we think. Never mind what suits us. There just is what you might call a colouring, a tenor, a character to reality itself. And faith, trust begins in that going out from our own self-oriented, self-centered concerns to say, well, reality is like that. But if that's where trust begins, there is something solid, something not me. Hope has to do with the sense that this reality, which is there, never mind me, is good as well as true. That is, it shares itself. It makes space for and gives possibilities to others, to us. And that's why hope is the natural outgrowth of trust. Reality is like this. It's there, but it's not just sitting there. It's actively loving. It's actively engaged with us. And it's not surprising, therefore, if hope then issues in love, in the sense that this generosity that we encounter in the reality that's beyond us prompts our own longing, our own love, our own continuing growth in selflessness. And all these discoveries, the discovery of reality as solid, the discovery of it as generous, the discovery of it as beautiful, all these things are things we can no more make up for ourselves or heat up for our own consumption than we can talk ourselves into speech or love ourselves into loving. In the Christian scriptures, faith and hope are more than once brought together. In the letter to the Hebrews, we read the tantalizing phrase that faith or trust is the substance of things hoped for. Faith and hope connect because there is substantiality to the world we encounter, but a substantiality, a reality and solidity that we long for because we recognize it as life-giving. So that's the first area I wanted to unpack a little bit. The notion of hope as more than just a feeling, the sense of it as a trustful confidence, growing out of that trust that there is a reality more than ourselves. The religious person will, of course, directly and ambiguously name that reality as God. And then, of course, if they have any sense, they'll step back and say, I'm not quite sure what I mean by that word, but what I mean is that ultimate truth and generosity and beauty, which eludes me, but still compels me. When I recognize that I've been given some glimpse of it, I know that there is something on which I can settle, a place where I can stand. And that connects, moving on a bit, with the way in which some interpreters, thinking about this tradition, have said, hope is a settled intention. A settled intention. And a firm belief in what's possible for me, for us as human beings, in terms of happiness. A settled intention to maintain our confidence that happiness is possible. And happiness here, of course, meaning a lot more than just feeling cheerful. More, you might say, a sense of there being somewhere we can come home to, somewhere where we can actually settle and live joyfully and peacefully. And in the next bit of what I want to explore, I'd like to turn to another great figure in the history of Christian thought, and that is the great 16th century Spanish mystic St. John of the Cross. He's often thought of as the first person really to connect hope with memory. Hope is grounded in memory. The memory of my own life, the sense looking back that I have in trust and in hope that I have encountered something which holds me, something which sustains and nurtures me. Not necessarily something that has solved my problems, protected me from mistakes, disasters and sufferings, but nonetheless a ground on which I stand. And that sense of being consistently held in something, held in a kind of grace, that is the way in which hope relates to memory. I look back, I see there is a story to be told, which has some consistency to it. I see that I have had a place to stand. The feelings, the experiences come and go, but nonetheless, something pulls forward, accompanies, nurtures. But very typically, St. John of the Cross then goes on to say that in our life of prayer, our growing up in Christ, there has to be at the same time a letting go of not memory, but memories. Quite easy, you see, to think back and say, well, that was a time when I experienced some kind of nourishment, some kind of help or grace. That's what grace is like. I must look for that experience all over again. And the risk of that is turning hope into a kind of imagination of particular outcomes in the future, thinking, oh, well, that's what I really want to happen. That's what my hope depends on. If that doesn't happen, it's all not worthwhile. I try to repeat or reproduce the experiences that have been meaningful for me in the past. And according to St. John of the Cross, that's one sure way of setting up not only for disappointment, but actually for shrinking and confining the scope, the measure, the magnitude of what faith and hope are really about. So the bottom line here is that the hope that grows out of trust is a firm confidence in the possibility of joyful, reconciled, peaceful homecoming, a confidence that is shaped by the memory we have, and yet not dependent on that in the sense that all that is going to happen is the reproduction, the repetition of that memory. And it's a confidence that, because of that rootedness, is not vulnerable to short-term disappointment, not vulnerable to being defeated by the brick walls that we run into. It's something that, because it is anchored in how things are, remains even underneath the hopelessness that so frequently surrounds us. And that's a dimension of trust and hope which is often quite difficult, frankly, for not only unbelievers but believers to lay hold of. We so want our hope to be hope for something we can plan for. Yet again, it's Christian scripture that says that hope in what we can see is not hope at all. If all we're hoping for is just the realization of what we imagine and what we specifically long for, well, once again, either we shrink God to the dimensions of our own imagination, or we set ourselves up for deep and perhaps bitter disappointment. The mystery is that sense of dogged, stubborn standing on the reality that we've been given to see a little bit of, that stubborn standing firm, is a gateway into love. A gateway into love because it doesn't lock us up in our own concerns, our own interests. It doesn't rest on that perennial temptation to remake the world in our own image with ourselves at the centre. So the trust and the hope that we've been talking about so far is a joyful desire for a possible good that abides even when we can't see what exactly lies ahead of us tomorrow or the day after. And it's perhaps that kind of thing that makes somebody like the great modern German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, when he talks about hope, describe God as present here, this moment, as the future, the mysterious future we can't see. God is present in the form of a possibility we haven't yet entered, but which we still recognize as there. The strange, elusive presence of the future we can't see, but which we can trust. Well, so far, I've been thinking aloud a bit about how to define faith and hope, how to define the kind of trust that we might call faithful and hopeful, with, as I said at the end of that particular trajectory, some sense of how that flowers and develops into love. But in spite of what was said earlier about the fact that we can't simply will ourselves into these theological virtues, we can't just get there by trying hard, we can still perhaps identify a few things that would count as opening us up to that sort of possibility. So I want, in the next bit of these reflections, to turn to 3 or 4 areas where we can identify the sorts of skills and practices and perceptions that keep trust and hope alive. And I'll start building on what we've just been thinking about in terms of memory. So the first thing, very obvious one really, if we are going to educate ourselves in and open ourselves to faith and hope, we need a narrative that we trust. We need a story about how the world most deeply is. A story within which we can recognize our own growing and discovering, our own flourishing, our own hoping, in the ordinary sense, within that larger picture. Without some such larger scale story, hope may just dwindle into mere optimism and whistling in the dark, always liable to be dismantled by unexpected events. So we need a story we can trust. And we see that it is trustworthy when we see that it has endured, that it has sustained the complex and difficult lives of particular people, that it's not been defeated. Again, when Nadezhda Mandelstam wrote her memoir about life in Stalin's Russia, and gave it that bitter title, Hope Against Hope, she was engaged in telling the story of her own life, and of course the life of her very famous poet husband, Osip Mandelstam, telling that story in a way which was designed to bring out the fact that this was a worthwhile perspective to see from, a good place to stand. It wasn't going to win in the short term. She knew that. And short-term optimism and having good feelings about things played very little part indeed in the life of people who were trying to survive with integrity under that particular tyranny. So what she's doing in her memoir of herself and her husband is to create a trustworthy story. To say, in effect, look, here are a couple of human lives which have been lived under appalling pressures, which have faced cruelty, betrayal, irrational, oppressive brutality, and yet somehow are still there, still holding on to some reality more important than success or failure. Only when at that very low point, that very darkest point of human experience, only there, it seems, can we fully understand what it is to hope, even when we have no idea at all of how we might get to where we long to be. And it grows out of that sense that this is a life worth living, and that it has been lived in a way that's been sustained by some vision. The Mandelstams were not devout religious believers, but something in their telling of the story has about it the character of faith, simply in the sense that it holds to the idea that there is something true and good and beautiful, which doesn't depend on Stalin's say-so. And so, secondly, within that big picture of a narrative we can trust, we need those specific stories, like Nadezhda Mandelstam's story. We need stories of lives that have been lived with integrity and consistency, even in darkness. Lives in which, we might say, lives in which the truth has come through. Quite often people say that you understand what faith looks like, not by reading a catechism, not by reading a theological tract, but by looking at lives that are faithful, which is perhaps why the Bible itself, Hebrew scripture and Christian scripture, don't on the whole do much in the way of argument. They say, in effect, you want to know what it is to live a life of trust and hope? Let me tell you about X and Y and Z. Let me tell you about Abraham. Let me tell you about King David. Let me tell you about Paul of Tarsus. Let me tell you about Mary Magdalene. And those specific stories in which truth has come through, those stories are not meant to be good examples, so that I say, oh, now I must behave like Mary Magdalene, or I must behave like St. Paul, or like Abraham. Not so much good examples. That wouldn't hurt if we were a bit more like some of them, but much more places where the possible has become actual, where we see that this alignment to truth and reality actually does begin to flesh itself out. And we see in those lives something of what we would long for, the possibility of holding our ground, the possibility of standing firm, finding a place from which to look and learn and grow. So those are two initial thoughts about what keeps faith, or trust, and hope, and indeed love alive. The stories in which the truth comes through. As I've said more than once, they don't have to be stories of success and triumph. Just stories of integrity, endurance. This is worthwhile, whatever the outcome. And that is immensely important in our current setting. On almost any calculation, the actual chances of things getting dramatically better in our world isn't terribly promising at the moment. Especially people involved in environmental protest will recognise both that this is the most important thing we could be witnessing about in terms of secular politics, and that it is a hope against hope. What many people in the environmental movement are concerned about is not simply solving a problem for tomorrow. It's something to do with finding an integrity today, finding a way of living in reality, in truthfulness today. And the strange thing is that that is the ground of a hope against hope. A hope against hope that is not going to be dismantled just by the fact that the chances in the world out there are not looking brilliant. But then the third thing to bear in mind in terms of what we're trying to grow into, the skills and habits we're trying to learn, the third thing is, very obviously, just learning to see ourselves afresh in a world that is larger than we are comfortable with, which is wonderful and also rather terrifying. A world where not all the resources are mine. A world where I don't quite know where the energy for change, renewal might come from. In Hebrew scripture, there's that wonderful story of the siege of a city in Israel by the armies of the king of Aram, and the prophet Elisha and his servant are in the city. The Arameans are trying to capture them. The prophet's servant panics, and the prophet prays to the Lord, "Open this young man's eyes." And in a wonderfully vivid image, the servant sees the hill on which the city is built, absolutely surrounded by horses and chariots of flaming fire. And the prophet says, "Those who are with us are more than those who are against us." Now, very few of us are given to see chariots of fire flaming around our situation. Yet that extraordinary glimpse of a world in which there may be more resources for our life and well-being than we ever dreamed of, that's the wonderful side of it. That's the glimpse of a resource of life, of goodness, beyond our imagination. But it's also a bit terrifying. We can't control this, we can't channel it, we can't bottle it and market it. We're not in charge. And that acceptance of not being in charge is a very tough thing indeed for human beings who have, as a race, made themselves a rather distinguished career in trying to control things and making a rather marked mess of it so far. But that's the third dimension of opening ourselves up, recognizing limits, both as a sobering and as an exhilarating thing. Learning to accept one's limits as a gift and a grace is a very fundamental thing in our growing up in the life of the Spirit. We need to recognize that if I say I'm in need of something, I'm not possessed of everything, then actually there is somewhere else from which that gift may come. It doesn't all have to come from me. And although it may be more satisfying for my ego to think that I can solve all my problems and feed all my hungers, ultimately it's good news that I don't have to. Apply that to the human race in general, to the human race in its cosmos, in its ecological situation, and you see that there are grounds for holding firm, living with an integrity aligned to some fundamental truth, not knowing where help and life may come from, and yet confident that if I or we run out of resources and ideas, that doesn't mean that reality itself runs out or runs away. And then, fourthly, one more thing to bear in mind in terms of developing this openness to reality. If that reality is beyond our capacity and beyond our imagining, it's quite important that, as St. John of the Cross indicates, we don't just desire to get something back, to repeat the experiences of the past, the goods we have known. We don't want to relive old lives. T.S. Eliot, in his 4 quartets, talks about waiting without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. I'm not sure about waiting without hope, but I take it that what he means is wait positively, steadily, trustfully, but don't tie your trust to the wish that things could just be brought back and restored. This suddenly makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, right at the moment when we're looking to what happens on the far side of the pandemic. Build back better is one of the slogans. And when people talk about the new normal, they are, as a rule, I think, trying to say that whatever we end up with in terms of the shape of our social and individual life on the far side of the present pandemic, it won't just be business as usual. Plenty of people have an enormous investment in making it business as usual, and it's rather depressing just how much our language slithers back towards that position. But a trustful and a hopeful stance at this moment would be to say, before us is something mysterious, not yet determined, not yet fixed. It is possible. Things will be different. But it's also up to us to work at that possibility. We don't just, to quote T.S. Eliot again, ring the bell backwards. That's the sense in which trust and hope really are about abandoning images and myths of ourselves, letting go of where we've started, letting go of what seems obvious and manageable. And we do it not passively, but in an intelligent, thoughtful, positive, putting one foot in front of the other. Keeping our minds, our hearts, on that central notion of a reality that is both durable and good, generous, self-sharing. Jürgen Moltmann talks about hope as being unreconciled to the present. And what he seems to mean by that is that readiness not to take for granted the way things are, when the way things are is deeply unjust, causing suffering, causing misery. Don't take it for granted, don't settle. Look through it and beyond it. There is a reality, a shape and a rhythm beyond that. Bring your life in tune with that. Hold to it. Let its gift soak through. And who knows what happens. But don't just settle. I think that's what's meant by seeing this as a mixture between a very active and a very receptive attitude. And I'd say that hopefulness is exactly the attempt to live on that particular knife edge. I have to accept certain things, that I'm not in charge, that I don't know how the ultimate energies of reality will work. I don't know what's around the corner and I can't guarantee success. Accept it. But then act. Out of your consistent, courageous practice of aligning with the reality that's beyond you, be ready to look round with discernment, with attention, and see what can be done that is in tune with that reality. That's hopeful living, neither overambitious nor passive, neither presumptuous nor despairing, to go back to points that were touched on before. So, with those four things in mind, let's just see if we can draw together a few thoughts by way of conclusion. I realise that quite a lot of this may sound rather abstract, and that idea of being unreconciled to the present, I'd want to say yes, fine, but we do also need to pin it down a bit. Don't take that in an over-abstract way, because what we need to be unreconciled with is specific events, specific situations. We don't just need apocalyptic language. We don't just need high-octane rhetoric about hope. We need, as I said, an intelligent, attentive scrutiny of where we are, always having in mind that it doesn't have to be like this, and that beyond this is something on which we can take a stand. Discernment and openness, intelligence and willingness to risk what can be done, even if it's very small. Once again, a very important consideration for people involved in environmental activism. All right, so you can't solve all the problems by the weekend. What can be done then with integrity and effectiveness today? And when particular hopes are not realized, the stories of change remain. We have stories to tell of our own lives and the life of the world because change does happen. We know that the world does not just spin around and repeat itself. And because we know that, we have once again a place to stand. We have a vision to live by. There is a depth to our standing, our attempts at consistency and integrity. And so we are confident that a difference can be made even if we don't fully know quite what that difference is and how it looks. But denial of the difficulty, presumption about it, that can once again land us in deeper despair at the end of the day. So, a last word to take us back for a moment to theology. I've been talking about trust and hope and their relation to one another, and about some of the practices that enable us to keep alive that life-giving relationship. And of course, the language of our faith as Christians is very deeply inflected by that relationship of trust and hope. When we meet as Christians, one of the first things we say, in effect, is, "What's done is done." The promises of God, the presence of God in Jesus Christ, the reality of the resurrection, that's done. It's there. God has promised. God has committed God's self. God has embodied that commitment in the life of a human being, Jesus of Nazareth. God has honoured that commitment in raising Jesus from death, in declaring that the divine commitment cannot be broken even by death itself. That's the shape of our Christian language. That's why we are people of hope and people of faith. And what we do as a Christian community is to flesh out that trustful hope, particularly when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. We say in the Eucharist, "This has been done. The promise has been made and honoured, and it's there, and nothing can be done about it." And so we thankfully, joyfully look to that abiding fact. It's a story which draws in, which faces honestly our own capacity for betrayal and failure. At the heart of it is that ultimate betrayal and failure, which is the abandonment of Jesus by those closest to him. And yet, it's a story which tells us precisely of a covenant, a promise that is, in Hebrew scripture quite literally, carved in stone. It is now carved in the stone that is the discarded blockage to Jesus' tomb. So when we meet for worship, we express our faith and our hope. We do really what I've just been summarizing. We say something about the world. We say something about lives in which the underlying reality comes through. We accept our limitation, and we look towards a future we don't yet know and certainly don't control. So, as we reflect together on living lives of trust and hope in a world apparently determined to undermine those things, those narratives that we can trust, those narratives of lives in which the truth comes through, those narratives acted out and celebrated day by day and week by week in the practice of this community and every believing community, all of those things become the ground on which we can affirm that we're in the world as a believing community, so that we too may be a place where the truth comes through, a place where something is seen to be possible. Difficult, but possible, as Sir Thomas Aquinas said. Thinkable, imaginable, and yet always elusive, but real where truth comes through, where the goodness of truth comes through, and where we're stirred, finally, to search for and embrace the beauty of that truth that continues to come through and to be a place where we can stand.
Thank you so much, Rowan. So if I might start off, you just spoke about Jesus in the closing remarks, and you talked fascinatingly about what's done is done. I wondered if I could push you a bit further on what will be. Possibly to some extent in a Julian of Norwich, all shall be well kind of a way, which obviously can be misused. But it strikes me, and it's a kind of theme we talk about at Advent a lot, that we live as Christians between the time of Christ's first coming and Christ's second coming. And however we conceive of Christ's second coming, it, shall we put it, and I don't mean this flippantly, it fulfills all the aspirations of the ecological movement and then some. And so there's a kind of, we have a phrase at St Martin in the Fields which we've used a lot, particularly in the pandemic period, living God's future now, which is our attempt to encapsulate what you've been describing. And that's the name of our whole Heart Edge series of seminars and conversations. But it seems to me to live in hope is to assume that we can have as much confidence in Christ's second coming as we have in Christ's first coming. But it's a recognition, and I think what you've said today has been really helpful in giving texture to the fragility of what we trust about Christ's first coming. It's a long time ago, although not in the light of eternity. The sources aren't all entirely overlapping about exactly what happened and so on. And also as you brought out, the trust. I think the one thing that I'd challenge you about, actually, parenthetically, was that you said the heart of the breaking of trust was the fleeing of the disciples and the betrayal of Judas. I wonder if it's an inner Trinitarian trust that is the most damaging thing on the cross when Jesus says, "Why have you forsaken me?" There's we can talk about that if you want to. But there's a fragility about our memory of trust, and that corresponds to the fragility of our confidence in Christ's second coming. But the two seem to me to mirror one another, and I wonder if I could push you to say a bit more about Christ's second coming and what that means in the language that you've used today, which is so consciously and so carefully expressed in a way that speaks to our secular world as well as to the church.
Oh, thank you. That's a really helpful question, I think, because the sense that the second coming of Christ is assured is quite deeply ingrained, isn't it, in Christian language? And I always think of the way in which, in the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, you give thanks for the second coming. You remember the second coming. That strange prayer after the consecration where you say, giving thanks for all that has been done, the cross, the grave, the resurrection, and the second coming. It's been done. Because in that wonderful image that Gregory Dix uses in his book on the liturgy, there's one coming of Christ to the Father, the eternal Word eternally brings the world home. And whatever the second coming means, it is that moment where the transfigured, the reconciled world is brought home. So, yes, there is a sense in which we are trusting in and confident in the same reality all the way through. First coming, second coming, creation, covenant, incarnation, resurrection, ascension, and the consummation. And I think it's also very perceptive to say that wobbliness about one bit of it probably entails wobbliness about others, and the wobbliness is there. It's a function of, I suppose, our human failures of imagination in some ways.
Could we say fragility rather than wobbliness?
We could say fragility if you like, yes. But I suspect that it's also important there to say we deal with that fragility. I won't say more than that. We deal with that fragility not by banging away at every detail of the initial story and saying, well, we've got to tack this down, we've got to prove this, we've got to get it sorted. We say, well, the ongoing reality is what you see day by day. It's the community living in the Spirit, making Eucharist day by day. That's the reality. Whatever happened in the New Testament, that was what emerged. And obviously, as a theologian, I must say a great deal more than that. I would want to tack down a few more things, but that's the place to start. This has been made possible. This daily recollection of past and future, this daily moment of bridging into the life of the gift, that's there. So I suspect that when we read Julian Rorridge saying all shall be well, we ought to read it in that sort of framework. She's not saying, as one modern translation rather unhappily has it, everything is going to be all right. And it's an interesting question as to why that sounds so flabby when all shall be well sounds so powerful. Something to do with monosyllables, I think. She's not saying everything's going to be all right. She is saying there is a homecoming, there is a gathering. And in some important sense, it's always been there, it's always been going on. So I very much warm to that echo, if you like, between first and second coming. Just coming back very briefly on the breakage of trust and the disciples running away. And yes, I hear what you're saying. I think there that the drama is the human psyche of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross, apparently fixed in that hope against and hope without hope. I'm cautious about saying intra-Trinitarian. I don't want to be ascribing lots of dramas and emotions to the eternal life of God, but in terms of what's going on in that moment, yes, Jesus is reciting a psalm which, like many other psalms, expresses precisely that moment when there is a God to be spoken to, and yet you have no idea where that God is and what that God is doing. Yet, my God, is the one half of the balance, the other half is, why aren't you there? And hope against hope.
So the thing that I then wanted, I would love for you to go on talking, and Richard and I not to bother, but if I wanted you to go on talking for another 20 minutes, the sort of last part of your lecture, it would be what happens then with the rupture of trust. I think of a person I know pastorally for whom Christian faith is out of reach because trust is out of reach. That a close relationship has been a source of great trauma, and for a very long time, and therefore that fundamental abiding, which you described so well just now, that abiding confidence that, if you like, it may be hard, but at least we're doing it together. And that sense of witness of us and God, solidarity, companionship, just isn't there. It's difficult for that person in any relationship. And so to put that on a grand canvas with God is just it's just out of reach, even if it would be nice to have.
Yes.
And of course, so much the Christian tradition is precisely about reconciliation, is precisely about what you do after the rupture of trust, and how trust is built up very slowly and lost very quickly. However, of course, it's all easier said than done.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk about hope and trust in relation to failure, loss, betrayal, and so on.
where trust breaks down, where people come to the conclusion that there is nothing to trust, then one of the risks is, of course, that becomes a kind of self-fulfilling thing. I expect the least, I expect nothing. And again, I think this is one area where we have at least to try to say something can be expected. Not every situation is doomed to that rupture. Now, I say that in general terms. I know, as you do in the pastoral setting, you can't just deliver that. It's all right, we'll look at sense. That's all right, isn't it? It's not like that, but you can sometimes at least say, or at least perhaps probe with people, almost saying, so what exactly do you trust? Are there things which have stuck for you? It may be a fleeting memory, it may be a particular image, it may be some words, it may be a piece of music, it may be the memory of one good relationship. But sometimes you can quarry a little bit and say, can you tell me about something that has not just gone away in your experience? And maybe that's a path to open out a little bit. Of course, one of the worst things there in relation to the church itself is, as I don't need to remind you or anybody listening, the number of people for whom the church is the agent of breaking trust. People whose trust in the church in all sorts of ways has been shattered. Most dramatically, of course, we all think of the record in child abuse. But there are lots of less obvious, less visible ways in which people feel routinely abused by the church. And every time I hear that from someone, that they trusted the church or they trusted a priest to listen, to welcome or to be there for them, and that was undermined every time, I feel the sharp point of that and think, well, that's a community I'm part of, and I'm complicit in that failure. And yeah, it's pretty sobering, and it's one of the things which does drive you, or drives me, to think the church is utterly incredible, or worse, if grace isn't real. So it drives me to think, well, where is grace to be seen? And very often then you find yourself in the strange position that you're saying, well, I stick with the church, I continue to live in the church because I sometimes see the grace of God at work outside it. And I think, well, the grace of God is there. So maybe this slightly ridiculous, slightly, more than slightly, anxious, confused, sometimes cruel, sometimes stupid institution is there to point to something which is real. And so, all right, let's see what we can do, but let the stories come of where grace is inside and outside the visible body.
Can I push you a bit more about so grace, I guess, perhaps in my limited imagination, is a sudden thing, or is not necessarily instantaneous. Whereas I think there's something here about the slow rebuilding of trust. And obviously, politically, most obviously Northern Ireland, but in other places, sure. That's a generational thing, and you've obviously had exposure to that on a lot. Could you talk a little bit about what you've learned, if you like, from your face-to-face encounter with relationships that have, they're not perfect, but they're a lot better than they were, and how that process, what the learnings are.
I have no hesitation in seeing grace in the slow as well as the quick, in that sense. The moment when somebody doesn't just make the stock response, but holds back just for a moment, and perhaps sometimes has the intelligence to say, what I felt like saying was so-and-so, and I knew that would close it down. You and I have sat in this room listening to people from different sides of the atrocities in Rwanda, talking about rebuilding. And I think what we saw was not a dramatic embrace of enemies, an ending of the story, anything but two people struggling not to be bound by stock responses, and centimetre by centimetre moving towards something that just might make another conversation possible. Now that I would very definitely see as grace. And that's, of course, the long story of Northern Ireland. It's a story which is still going on in many places and has barely started in many others. I'm thinking of the way in which in South Africa all the great things about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have somehow not quite got to the heart of darkness, the heart of sense of betrayal and hostility there. So what gives me hope and trust is that capacity in a conversation, in an encounter, for people to say, almost as simple as, I can't just sit here. I can't just repeat. It would be very easy to go round and round the performance of the familiar script. But I can't quite do that, and I can't quite do it because I'm here with a concrete other person. And I can't just let the shutters down. So bringing people face to face in those circumstances remains significant if it's given the right time and the right environment.
Well, that's saying something significant though, because when we sat here together some while ago, there were other people in the room.
Yes.
And it's almost like encouraging people to build trust
Yes.
with one another based on the respective
Yes.
trust they have with not their team, because there were people who were trusting across, but that seemed to show something important, that actually a public conversation, albeit with a couple of dozen people, is different to the demands. And I guess people talk so much about power relationships in almost every context today, but within that sort of context, if there's just the two of you, there's genuine fear for your own well-being, because it wasn't so long ago that your father did this to my brother.
Yes.
But with that, and I just wonder, you talked about the saints in a sense as significant examples in your second category, but there's something about the communion of saints that holds us when we are trying to make some strides towards each other.
Yes, I agree, absolutely. It's what kind of human context gives you the freedom to say that to yourself. I can't just sit here. Because there is a committed, sympathetic, non-judging audience who are holding the space, and that's a rare thing, but it is one of the things which I really wish the church did rather more of, being that.
Well, I always think at a wedding, when a couple get into real trouble 6 months after the wedding, I'm thinking pre-pandemic now, there's the social pressure of the fact that there were 150 people there, and I can't let them down by just walking out at the first sign of trouble. And there's a similar kind of level of appropriate social pressure.
That's a very interesting parallel. Yes,
we've all turned up to watch you at least try to talk to one another. So we're just going to sit here with our arms folded until you do, however long it takes. And there's a good social pressure in that.
And there's a funny way of reversing that as well. And I'm thinking here of the conversations that I've come across in the context of the Bereaved Families Forum, Israel and Palestine, where you'll get individuals from each side who have already built a relationship, deliberately going into a larger environment to give permission and freedom for the larger group to shift, which is just as risky, just as uncertain. But again, it's as if they're then saying, look, we, at some cost to ourselves, are holding this. Now we are saying to you, you can't just sit there. We're here and you have an investment in.
Rowan, how You were talking about the pandemic, and that greater reality of people finding a greater reality in their circumstances. And I think from conversations we've had, and I've had, and you must have had, the first 3 months of the pandemic, although people felt the fear and the angst of that, there was also a real sense in many of the people we talked to of discovering a greater reality. The air was cleaner. There was a chance to get out and walk, to rediscover family, friendships, this kind of thing. But it's almost like the people are waiting on the borders, and now the panic is, unless we do something, unless we respond, unless we provide solutions, people are going to get, we're being negligent. How do you keep the space open? How do you keep that space open for God's grace when the pressure is to provide answers? And I've lived, as you've experienced, other cultures which are much, much better than this culture at keeping spaces open for God to be active. But, Western society is very much based on solutions.
Very much, yes. Yes, and people find it very hard to hear that there aren't solutions. There are responsible actions that can be taken with, as I think I was saying, with intelligence and attention. They may or may not be solutions. And what you've talked about is, in a sense, it's quite close to what I was trying to disentangle. As time's gone on, you're quite right. I think people have become more rather than less anxious about all this. Not so much because of any large-scale conviction that we're all doomed, but because of sheer frustration and confusion. And also a kind of cynicism, I'm afraid, about some of the decision makers in all this. Are they really paying attention? And that does begin to drive the spiral downwards, doesn't it? So I suspect that part of what we as Christian believers might be saying in all this is, let's not talk for the moment about global solutions, large-scale answers to the problem. Let's ask, what is going to keep you and those you care about safe in the immediate environment? We're not going to nail down everything. What's going to make you feel that you are acting with due care and respect towards one another? Don't abandon common sense. Don't be over legalistic. But what are the steps that can be taken? Up to our eyes in this, as you can imagine, in the college, where these are the questions we're trying to resolve daily as we look to the return of a very large number of young people, precisely the population among whom infections are rising. And I suppose the message we're trying to get across is, we will as a community do all we can to facilitate friendship and confidence. And if we ask you to observe these particular protocols, that's why. And we will go on with you, looking at them and reviewing them. But this is what we think makes sense as a way of respecting one another. And perhaps we have to start at that very basic level. And beyond that, of course, it does matter whether or not people think the salvation of the world is down to them.
You talked about hope against hope. What would be if in the, every crisis brings about the chance of a new hope? What would be your hope that could come out of this present period of time?
Well, going back to where I started, what I would wish, let's just leave it at that. What I would wish to see is maybe two things above all. One is exactly what you mentioned earlier on, and that is that people won't lose the sense of relating a bit differently to the world they're in, the sense of valuing the clean water and the clean air, and the lower pressure, and the less crowded travelling, and all the rest of it. I just want us to go on saying, look, remember that felt good, didn't it? That was one of those narratives of trust, in a way. We discovered in that moment something we had not quite expected, which was that the world was still there and still sort of precious, and something had just opened a little bit of a gap in the smog. Don't forget that. It's there, it can happen. Second thing is really growing out of that. If we are building back, we do not have to reconstruct. We have an opportunity of thinking about different working patterns, the different social possibilities that come out of different working patterns, and of course, above all, the chance to get a bit more of a grip on the need for effective environmental legislation. I would hope that people will just have those two things. I would wish that people have those two things, and because both of those have come through with a certain amount of reality, a certain amount of force, then they correspond to what I'm saying about hope. There's something there. The truth has come through.
You talked about discovering forms or disciplines in our own lives which can actually help us keep that hope alive and keep that sense of openness to God. And I know from your writing and how important contemplative prayer is, which is really in many ways an experience of that 3 months. It's becoming more attentive to those around us and to the natural world and to the things that we really value. How important do you see that greater contemplativeness as a sign of growth within the church, or as a way forward for the church?
It has to be a key thing, doesn't it? Because the contemplative attitude is, as you've just said, not just something restricted to prayer, though it's central to it. It spills over. If we are learning to hold still, to stand or sit with where we are, with the reality ahead of us, to sit with the unmanageable grace, the endless life of God, then, well, by God's grace, slowly again, something begins to wear away or melt away inside, that compulsion to organize, solve, dominate. And we take that wherever we go with us. If the church is to be a place of trust and hope, of mind, love, that's the centre out of which it all flows, I think. And the good news and the bad news, you might say, is you just do it. You have to do it. There are no shortcuts. It's that daily exposure to the possibility of frustration and difficulty, which prayer involves, the struggles of keeping silence and holding still, physical and mental struggles. Sorry, but that is what is asked of us. That's where our healing lies.
And on a wider scale, on a social level, isn't something of the change that can take place a greater listening to the social problems of our age? I've got members of my family who work in the emergency relief movement, and I know you've been involved with Christian Aid, but they were saying how things have got to change dramatically. So instead of the kind of expertise coming from the Western world going out to visit these places of need or emergency, but actually listening more, rediscovering the strength that comes from the local community.
Indeed. I think often of the way in which in the Gospels Jesus will say to people, "What do you want me to do for you?" Not walking in and flashing the miraculous powers around, but Now, what's this about? What do you want? And listening. And it seems to me a key element in growing beyond those bits of the inheritance of colonialism and other kinds of unjust power, rediscovering the fact that other people have voices, desires, presence, and that there are times just to shut up and let them talk. You mentioned Christian aid. One of the principles we try to work with, not always very successfully, is to go with what's actually happening already on the ground rather than coming with a program. But I'm also thinking of it in terms of the experience of this institution and many others in response to the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. I think part of what has been said to people who share white privilege is, look, don't try to come up with a solution. Don't try and make it all right. Don't tell us how we're feeling or how we ought to feel. Would you mind just please being quiet while we find out where we are and who we are? And just trying to find the right atmosphere, the right structure in a community like this. Drafting terms of reference for a group in college that will let this come to focus a bit. Quite a challenge. And when we had an online seminar on the subject for past and present members of the college back in July, that was one of the most difficult lines to tread. Are we just talking into other people's lives? Or are we listening? Are we conversing? Because, picking up the phrase I used earlier, that sense of I can't just sit here. In this instance, I can't just sit here also means for me as a white person in this situation, I must just sit here in the sense of listening. I can't just sit here and repeat. I have to ask myself how my world might change. And of course, people find it threatening, and of course, there are all sorts of what some people would think of as exaggerations, and there's violent language thrown around on both sides. Yeah, okay. But there is a historic imbalance and injustice. The only way of getting through this is seeing it more clearly and more truthfully, and that requires us to do some hard hearing rather than more talking.
You talked about narratives of integrity that give us strength during these times of doubt, that give us hope. What for you are the narratives of integrity at the moment that can actually give hope?
I know it's a cliche, or has become a cliche in recent months, but I am still struck by the very prosaic narrative of people in the caring professions in this country. When, around Easter, the New Statesman published that long article, essentially about a doctor's week in London, in a hospital on the front line, I thought that's a story which has integrity, a story through which truth comes through. So yes, that's certainly one thing. And I don't know, I also go back to not particularly contemporary, but recent memories. I mentioned the Bereaved Families Forum. Just watching people honestly dealing with immense loss, pain and trauma. Balancing the sense that they can't just be stuck with the sense that they can't just deny or forget. And it's people often in exactly that point, struggling not to deny and not to forget, where I see truth coming through, where I see lives that I think are, yes, definitions of how trust and hope work.
Can I get a bit more cosmic again and take you to two dimensions of theology, Trinity and Heaven? I'm wondering, and I haven't put it like this before, but I'm wondering in this conversation whether the definition of heaven is where hope and trust meet, and actually, if you think of trust in that way, what could be more? Obviously it's succinct. It's not the full picture, but if there's one quality of heaven that we don't experience in this life, that we hope to experience eternally, that is the fruit of all the benefits of Christ's passion, to put it in Calvin's way, then trust would pretty much be it. Just imagine existence where we could truly trust one another and there was no dissemblance and there was no betrayal. Things were, what you see is what you get.
Yes.
And then I wonder if you could talk a bit about what trust then means in the Trinity in a perhaps corresponding way.
I think that's absolutely right about heaven. That's I think why I use the word homecoming. Since yes, we are simply welcome. Wherever we turn is welcome. The welcome that God the Holy Trinity gives to us, as it were, permeates the whole company of heaven, whatever it means to be in the fellowship of all those who are invited to God's presence. Everywhere we look is welcome. And therefore, nowhere we look is there cause for fear or rejection, a sense of rejection. And I also think of a phrase from Peter Abelard in his hymn, "Wish and fulfilment shall severed be ne'er." That is, in heaven, desire and fulfilment must coincide. Not that there is no sense of loving and joyful longing, but that loving and joyful longing is not at all frustration, whatever. There is a thirst and there is water, as it were, simultaneously. So, yes, that seems to me what we look for there, that trust and hope are, in one sense, swallowed up in presence, but in another sense, all that is positive in trust and hope endure forever, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, they abide. But love is what then embraces and consolidates them. I suppose, trying to think about the life of God the Holy Trinity, trust isn't a word I've been inclined to use in that context. I suppose because in our environment, our finite context, it's always bound up with some element of, as it were, risk. But if we were to say that we're thinking of something like an intelligence eternally secure in its giving and receiving, no breach in what's given, no distortion of what's received, no holding back, then our own human experience of trust at its fullest is just a faint glimmer of a reflection of that, maybe.
Rowan, you're just about to go through your new rites of passage where you you retire from here and move to Wales. What is the hope for your retirement for you personally, and what is the grace you take with you from the memory of the story that you?
I hope to have some time and space, as they say, to make my soul a bit. That is, to give more time just to being in the presence. By which I don't necessarily mean I'm going to be trying to pray 6 hours a day, but just finding a rhythm which is less distorted and less interrupted by the pressures of trying to run things. And sometimes said to people that what I most look forward to is not chairing meetings, which I've been doing for the last 35 years or so. And in all seriousness, to step a little bit aside from some of the often controlling and difficult expectations that surround that, which is another way probably of saying I'd like to be preparing for a good death, ultimately, which I hope won't be too soon, but in all seriousness, trying to quieten down. Which is, when people say, oh, you must have lots more books to write. I don't know. I don't feel any obligation to write lots more books. If there are things I would generally like to say, I hope I might find the freedom to say them, but I don't feel that's an imperative. Taking with me, I think in the last 7 or 8 years, the greatest grace and gift here in this community and college has simply been having colleagues on whom I've relied. I think the college has been a trustful community on the whole, a community where different bits of the ensemble, staff, students, teaching, fellows, and so on, have on the whole been able to speak with some openness to each other. And that has been enormously enriching and healing, to be honest, after the sort of position in the church where it's rather difficult to feel you're in the middle of a group of colleagues in the same way, or a community in the same way. So I've been deeply grateful for rediscovering community, mutuality, and yes, trust, if you like.
I think we've reached the end of our conversation. I think Richard and I, on your behalf, have both been deeply enriched by our time together. Just a few things to say for those who are joining us online. First of all, to say, despite the grief of this event coming to an end, there are 2 more events to look forward to. Neil McGregor and Paula Gooder are both going to be presenting in this series, so do stay tuned, and those will both be in person as well as online events. Do also look elsewhere on the website for details of how you can contribute financially to this series and the costs of this series. It's become such a precious part of St Martin's life and a part of our contribution to wider discourse in church and society, and I hope you'll feel like we do. It's well worth investing both in this particular series and in this way of approaching theology and public issues on behalf of the wider society. I want to conclude by profoundly thanking Dr. Williams, or Rowan as we like to call him, for searching the depths of our souls and inspiring us to live richer lives. We are all conscious of the impoverishment and the constraints that the pandemic has brought upon us. I think in Rowan's remarks today, we have seen the deeper truths that abide beyond, above, and after the pandemic, and we have been renewed in our commitment to be part of God's future. Thank you, Rowan, and thanks to everybody for joining this conversation.